Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kris. This is Military Reforms of Alexander the Great. This was not a request, this was just a video I just saw on the side of my feed. I just did Misconceptions of World War I. That was really cool by, I already forgot the channel. It was by the channel that did it. So, Military Reforms of Alexander the Great. Let's go ahead and get into. I don't know if I covered this when I did hit the Alexander the Great videos, so we're going to do it anyways because it looks interesting. Oh, that's unsafe. All those candles around those books. It's not good.
It is 336 BC. And Philip II of Macedon is dead. In his lifetime, he had completely overhauled the Macedonian army, transforming it into the greatest force the Hellenic world had yet seen. In this episode, we shall cover the evolution and reorganization of the Macedonian army during the reign and conquest of Philip's son, Alexander the Great. Arguably, the element of the Macedonian army that evolved the most during Alexander's conquests was his siege machinery. Just as his father had before him, Alexander quickly embraced the great potential of siege warfare for his campaign. Ladders remained the most cost-effective way to capture a settlement, and we know Alexander took many smaller towns using them. Yet to conquer the more formidable defences of the larger Achaemenid fortresses, Alexander required more complex, awe-inspiring engines. Just as Polyidus was for Philip, one engineer was crucial to the evolution of siege machinery during Alexander's infamous campaign. His name was Diades. A resident of Pella, Diades had been a student of Polyidus and succeeded him as chief engineer at the time of Alexander's accession. Diades would create several new siege engines during Alexander's reign. Arguably one of the greatest was the Troponon, the borer. Designed to ram down a settlement's walls, simple borers had been in existence before Diades. Yet it was he who radically improved its design.
I'd never heard of it, never even seen it.
Like the ram, Diades' borer consisted of a wooden beam with a metal head. It would be attached with ropes that were connected to pulleys and winches, so when the mechanics pulled the ropes, it would exert a powerful force on the ram and cause a large breach in the wall.
Okay.
Diades not only increased the borer's power, but also its protection. The beam was placed inside a mobile wooden shield called a chelone, or tortoise. Alongside the borer, Diades invented many other formidable siege engines. This included a grappling machine designed for pulling down defences and a much improved drawbridge called an epibathra. This drawbridge acted as a gangway which soldiers could use to cross over from either a siege tower or ship. Although the drawbridge had been in use before Alexander's time, it was Diades who dramatically increased its effectiveness. Diades would also make modifications to many existing siege engines, such as the ram, protected with a tortoise, and the siege tower, increased mobility and better drawbridge. Many of these engines would be used during Alexander's successful siege of Tyre.
These had to travel with them, didn't they? This isn't something that they would build when they got to the area to siege. They carried these with them. Wow.
Arguably Alexander's greatest military feat. Consequently, Diades became known as the man who took Tyre. There were other engineers that accompanied Alexander. The talented engineer Carius was essential in the creation of various siege machines designed to counter specific defences. At Halicarnassus, for example, we hear the Macedonians employed ditch-filling tortoises to aid an assault on the city. Another prominent engineer, Posidonius, would design a modified siege tower for Alexander. Its wheels were mounted on a sturdy timber chassis, which provided a strong base for the tower. Inside the chassis, 150 men would man the contraption that would push the engine's wheels towards the enemy wall. As well as containing other levels for stone-throwing torsion catapults or lithoboloi, the tower had two main floors. One floor was placed at a level that would be the same height as the opposing battlements. The other level was placed higher up, level with the top of a defending tower. The drawbridge would be lowered when the tower reached the wall, through which the attackers would cross over onto the defences. Facing such a complex and deadly mobile machine must have been terrifying for any defending force. Significant developments would also be made to Alexander's artillery throughout his campaign. Polyidus' creation of the torsion catapult under Philip was revolutionary for siege warfare, and Diades and his fellow engineers continued to improve upon his initial design. By the start of Alexander's Persian conquest, no longer were these torsion catapults used to primarily fire arrows at the defenders themselves. Thanks to further advancements, they were now able to also fire stones with enough power to smash down enemy walls. They were called lithoboloi, or stone throwers. Very quickly,
I'm gonna guess that, sorry. There you go. I'm gonna guess that these stones weren't like tiny. These had to be probably good sized stones, I'm gonna take it. Does anyone know the size of them?
Diades, Carius, and the rest of the Macedonian engineers made further improvements to these lithoboloi. At the sieges of Halicarnassus and Tyre, for example, we hear of highly destructive torsion stone throwers called petroboloi being used in Alexander's army. These devastating machines could either be wheeled or wheelless and could be placed on land, on siege towers, and on ships.
It would not have destroyed a wall that quickly, I'm gonna guess, right? No.
Alexander continued to use other types of artillery, such as the arrow-firing torsion catapult, the successor to the non-torsion oxybelus used by his father. Each of these machines provided covering fire for his troops and were manned by teams of specialized artillerymen. What made these great engines even more fascinating was their portability. It was Alexander who truly embraced the concept of designing siege equipment that could be dismantled and reused elsewhere. Throughout his campaign, both by sea and land, his army's great siege engines were dismantled, transported, and then reconstructed at various locations.
Okay, that answers my previous question. That makes sense. I was gonna say, to haul that thing is ridiculous.
During the siege of Gaza, for example, Alexander ordered Diades' siege engines used at Tyre to be dismantled and transported by sea to be quickly reconstructed. The Macedonian infantry and cavalry.
Just 1 minute a day, the easiest way to regrow hair from home. There's no need to worry
Anybody
about
need to
receding
regrow hair?
hairlines or a thinning crown anymore. All types of hair.
Sorry.
Infantry and cavalry
You'll have to watch that on your own time.
would also evolve during Alexander's reign. Upon his accession, Alexander inherited the most revered infantry force of the time. Yet he would quickly instigate changes to it. Perhaps to ensure their loyalty, Alexander quickly extended the name Peshetaibroi, or Foot Companions, to include the entirety of his phalanx, while the elite infantry of Philip II became known as the Hypaspists. Whether the Peshetaibroi of Philip were the same soldiers who formed the Hypaspists of Alexander is unknown. The Peshetaibroi of Alexander's army experienced no significant changes for much of Alexander's conquest. Its soldiers remained in basic units of 16 men, called a decus, which could be combined to form a lokos of 128 men. 12 of these lokoi combined formed a battalion of 1,536 men. Small changes in structure, however, do appear to have occurred for the Hypaspists. new sub-commanders appointed by merit were introduced into the elite unit. Companies of 500 men were commanded by a Pentecostiarch, while units of 1,000 were commanded by a Chiliarch. The Hypaspists consisted of 3,000 men in total, so the unit had 6 Pentecostiarchs and 3 Chiliarchs altogether. Later, following Alexander's death, his Hypaspists would receive a new name to reflect their high quality: the Argiraspides, or Silver Shields, used most notably by Eumenes during his great campaign against Antigonus. From the Granicus in 334 BC to the Hydaspes in 326 BC, the Macedonian phalanx was the nucleus of Alexander's army. Yet, as Alexander's campaign went on, reinforcements from Macedon ended, and the number of his foot companions slowly dwindled. Alexander lost many of his Macedonians due to death, injury, old age, or being settled somewhere in his empire, and by 324 BC, less than 10,000 remained. Alexander had no option but to radically reorganize his Macedonian phalanx, incorporating Iranian infantry into the battalions. In each decus, only 4 of the 16 men remained Macedonians, stationed at the front and rear in the formation. The rest were Persian levies, not trained with the sarissa and instead using their native armaments, the bow and javelins. This mixed phalanx lacked the cutting edge and flexibility of the original, and thus did not stand the test of time following the death of Alexander. Alexander had seen this as a temporary measure, yet he still needed to bridge the divide between the conquered and the conquerors in his army if he were to be a legitimate king of Asia. One way he realized he could do this was by removing his reliance on his Macedonian infantry and improving the quality of his Asian footmen. In 327 BC, Alexander ordered 30,000 Asians to be recruited and trained in the Macedonian manner. Trained by Macedonian veterans, these Oriental youths would undergo constant practice in the use of Macedonian arms and discipline for the next 2 years, separate from their Macedonian counterparts.
Wow.
At the beginning of 324 BC, they were presented to Alexander at Susa, dressed in Macedonian attire, well trained in the sarissa phalanx, and a rival to the Macedonians themselves. So much so that Alexander labelled them as his epigoni, or successors. By the end of 324 BC, Alexander's powerful Macedonian sarissa phalanx was no longer the undisputed key infantry force in his army. Now there was a rival, equally prestigious formation in Alexander's force. The Macedonian cavalry too evolved during Alexander's reign, most notably with the companions. Philip had arranged his companions into elay squadrons based on the regions where they owned their land. Each squadron, 200 men strong, was commanded by a squadron leader called an iliarch, who wielded great power in the field. Alexander altered this. In 331 BC, perhaps to curb each squadron commander's power, Alexander began to reform the command structure. He divided each elay into 2 smaller units called lokoi. In charge of each of these, he appointed new sub-commanders called lokogoi. These appointments were based on merit and not the region associated with each squadron. These lokogoi owed their newfound power to Alexander, and their loyalty became unquestionable. The power of the original iliarch was curbed significantly, as was the regional affiliation of each of the squadrons. In 330 BC, Alexander made a crucial decision that would forever change the organization of his companions. Philotas, the son of Alexander's second-in-command, Parmenion, and the overall commander of the entire companion cavalry body, was accused of being involved in a conspiracy against the king and duly executed along with his father. Alexander then divided the command over his companions between 2 of his closest friends, Cleotus the Black and Hephaestion. Never again would he allow one man total control of his elite cavalry unit. Furthermore, Alexander changed the name for the basic unit of the cavalry. From 330 BC onwards, he no longer labelled his companion regiments as Elay squadrons, but hipparchies. The term Elay continued to be used as a subdivision of each hipparchy, with 2 Elay squadrons together forming one hipparchy. As for the Royal Squadron, or Basilike Elay, this too appears to have had its name changed at this time to the Agema. Consequently, Cleotus and Hephaestion also received a new title and were called hipparchs. By 327 BC, Alexander increased the number of hipparchs commanding the companions to 8.
Why all the name? I mean, the name changes. I understand if you're going to change formations and everything like that, but just the renaming of things was that just. I don't know. Was that he just felt like it didn't? He just was whatever. He didn't want to call it that, so he wanted to call it this. That's kind of how it feels.
Including men such as Perdiccas and Craterus, who would later become the Diadochi. Alexander would also introduce Oriental horsemen into his companion cavalry. By 324 BC, 4 hipparchies of the companions consisted solely of picked Iranian cavalrymen, and a 5th contained a mixture of Oriental and Macedonian horsemen. We also know that certain Asian nobles were incorporated into the royal Agema. Consequently, the companions were no longer a select Macedonian unit from the region's nobility. With the creation of the foreign hipparchies of the companions and the epigoni, certain Oriental units had become just as prestigious as his Macedonians by the end of Alexander's reign.
Cool.
It was not just the companions that Alexander greatly reorganized, however. Great change also appears probable to the Macedonian light cavalry, the prodromoi. Following 329 BC, any reference to the Macedonian light cavalry disappears completely from our sources. What happened to the prodromoi is unknown, although many now suspect Alexander merged them with his reorganized companions and placed them within the new-look hipparchies. From then on, Alexander's light cavalry came mostly from his Asian units, such as his horse archers from Dahe. By the end of Alexander's reign, the Macedonian army had significantly evolved from that of his father Philip. We will cover other critical parts of his army in the next episodes, so make sure that you are subscribed.
That was really interesting. I wish there was some understanding, or maybe I just completely missed it, as to why he renamed things, why he changed the name, other than he just changed the name. Or I guess maybe it had some kind of meaning for him. I don't know. Maybe I missed that. I'm really tired, so I do apologize. I'm going to go ahead and end this here. Like and subscribe. Have a good day. Have a good night.